The small diner buzzed with the usual morning rush, the clinking of plates and the low hum of conversations blending into a comforting rhythm. It was the kind of place where regulars gathered, and the staff knew most customers by name, or at least they were supposed to. But today, something felt different. At the corner table, an elderly man sat alone, his wrinkled hands carefully unfolding the menu. He looked out of place among the hurried businessmen and chatty groups of friends. His clothes were clean but modest, and his posture suggested a quiet humility. He smiled faintly at the waitress who approached his table, but her expression remained cold. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped and impatient. Without waiting for a response, she tapped her pen against her notepad, her irritation barely concealed. The man hesitated, scanning the menu with a slight tremor in his hands. "I'll just have a coffee and the breakfast special, please," he said softly. The waitress rolled her eyes, her lips curling into a smirk. "Figures," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for him and anyone nearby to hear. "You people always order the cheapest thing on the menu." A few heads turned, and a hush fell over the tables closest to them. The man's cheeks flushed, but he said nothing, only nodding politely as she walked away. In the kitchen, she laughed with her coworkers, mocking the old man's shabby appearance. "Probably just another cheapskate trying to stretch a dollar," she sneered, unaware that her words were being overheard. But as the morning unfolded, the waitress's dismissive attitude grew harder to ignore. Each time she returned to the man's table, her comments became sharper, her disdain more evident. Yet the man remained calm, his eyes kind and his demeanor unshaken. Then, just as the waitress delivered the check with an exaggerated sigh, something unexpected happened. The diner's manager appeared, his face pale and his expression urgent. He whispered something in the waitress's ear, and her smirk vanished in an instant. Her eyes darted to the old man, now rising slowly from his seat. There was something about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence, a presence that demanded attention. The waitress's hands trembled as she realized who he really was. The waitress froze, her heart racing as she watched the old man gather his things. The manager's whispered words played over and over in her mind, but they didn't make sense. How could this be true? She glanced back at the man, now standing by the table, his weathered face calm but unreadable. The other customers had started to notice the shift in atmosphere. Conversations hushed and curious glances were cast in the old man's direction. He didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't care. His movements were deliberate, almost practiced, as he reached for his wallet. The waitress felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had been so certain of her assumptions earlier, so quick to judge him by his appearance. Now, as the truth began to dawn on her, she felt an unfamiliar pang of regret. But it was too late to take back her words or the disdain she had shown him. The manager stepped forward, his voice trembling slightly as he addressed the man. "Sir, I didn't realize you were here. Please, let us take care of your meal. It's on the house." The old man looked up, his eyes meeting the manager's. There was no anger in his gaze, only a quiet understanding that made the waitress feel even smaller. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "But I prefer to pay for what I order." He placed a few bills on the table, enough to cover the meal and leave a generous tip. The waitress stared at the money, her cheeks burning with shame. She wanted to say something, to apologize, but the words caught in her throat. As the man turned to leave, the manager followed him to the door, speaking in hushed tones. The waitress strained to hear, but the sounds of the diner drowned out their conversation. She could only watch as the old man nodded once, then stepped outside into the crisp morning air. For a moment the room felt frozen in time. The waitress stood rooted to the spot, her mind racing with questions. Who was he? What had the manager said to him? And why did it feel like the entire diner had just witnessed something extraordinary? One of her coworkers nudged her gently. "You okay?" they asked, their voice low. She nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied, though the truth was far from it. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and guilt, and she couldn't shake the image of the old man's kind eyes. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She went through the motions, taking orders and delivering plates, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man. She replayed every interaction in her mind, cringing at how dismissive and rude she had been. By the time the diner closed for the day, she was exhausted, not from the work, but from the weight of her own regret. She lingered in the kitchen, hoping to catch the manager before he left. When he finally appeared, she hesitated, unsure how to approach him. "Hey," she began, her voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" The manager looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" "That man from earlier," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Who was he? Why did you act like that when you saw him?" The manager sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know, do you?" he asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and disappointment. She shook her head, her curiosity growing. "No, I don't. But I feel like I should." He studied her for a moment before speaking. "That man is Mr. Harris," he said quietly. "He's not just some random customer. He's the owner of this diner and a dozen others across the state." The waitress's jaw dropped. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The manager nodded. Yeah. He started this place decades ago, back when it was just a little hole in the wall. Built it up from nothing. And now he likes to visit his diners from time to time, just to see how things are going." The waitress felt her stomach drop. She had spent the entire morning humiliating the very man who made her job possible. But why didn't he say anything? She asked, her voice shaking. "Why didn't he tell me who he was?" The manager shrugged. "That's not his style. He doesn't want special treatment. He just wants to see how people are treated when they think no one's watching." The weight of his words hit her like a ton of bricks. She had failed the test spectacularly. As she left the diner that night, her mind was a storm of emotions. Shame, regret, and a lingering sense of unease all swirled together. She couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harris, about the quiet dignity he had shown despite her behavior. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of a lesson she would never forget. Would you like to continue the story from here? The waitress barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Harris sitting at the corner table, his kind expression unwavering despite her cruel words. Her mind replayed every moment of their interaction, each memory sharper and more painful than the last. She felt a pit in her stomach that wouldn't go away, a gnawing guilt that grew stronger with every passing hour. The next morning, she arrived at the diner earlier than usual. The air was crisp and the street was quiet except for the occasional car passing by. She stood outside for a moment, staring at the diner's familiar sign, the one she had walked under so many times without a second thought. Now it felt different, heavier somehow, like it carried a meaning she hadn't fully appreciated before. When she walked inside, the smell of coffee and freshly baked pastries greeted her, but the usual comfort it brought was absent. She glanced around nervously, half expecting to see Mr. Harris already seated at his usual spot. But the table was empty, and the diner was still quiet, with only a few early customers scattered around. Her manager was in the back, sorting through paperwork. She approached him cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, though she didn't need to explain who she meant. The manager looked up, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe," he said after a pause. "He usually does. But if I were you, I wouldn't count on it." His words stung, but she knew he was right. She had no reason to expect Mr. Harris to return, not after the way she had treated him. Still, a part of her hoped she might get the chance to make things right. As the morning rush began, she threw herself into her work, determined to do better. She greeted every customer with a smile, took orders with patience, and went out of her way to make sure everyone felt welcome. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The hours dragged on, and by the time lunch rolled around, she was exhausted. She leaned against the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, when she heard the sound of the door opening. She looked up, and her heart skipped a beat. There he was, standing in the doorway, his presence as unassuming as ever. He wore the same modest clothes, carried the same quiet air of humility. But now, knowing who he was, she saw him differently. For a moment, she froze, unsure of what to do. Then, summoning every ounce of courage she had, she approached him. "Good morning," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Welcome back." He looked at her, his eyes kind but unreadable. "Good morning," he replied, his tone even. "Can I get you a table?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, and she led him to the same corner table he had sat at the day before. As he took his seat, she hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Harris, I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't know who you were, and I shouldn't have treated you the way I did. It was wrong, and I feel terrible about it." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said simply. She waited, hoping he might say more, but he didn't. Instead, he opened the menu and began to scan it, just as he had the day before. Unsure of what else to do, she stepped away, giving him space. But as the minutes passed, the tension in the air grew thicker. The other staff had noticed him too, their whispers and stolen glances making it clear that everyone was on edge. Even the customers seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. When she returned to take his order, her hands were shaking. He ordered the same meal as before coffee and the breakfast special, and she hurried to the kitchen to put it in. As the food was being prepared, she couldn't stop herself from watching him. He sat quietly, his posture relaxed, as if he were completely unaware of the stir he was causing. But she knew better. There was a weight to his presence, a quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. When she brought his food to the table, she tried to gauge his mood, but his expression remained calm and unreadable. He thanked her politely, then began to eat, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The rest of the diner seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. The waitress felt the tension building, each passing moment adding to the suspense. She wanted to say more, to explain herself, but she didn't know how to begin. And then, just as he was finishing his meal, the door to the diner opened again. This time, it wasn't another customer. It was a delivery person carrying a large envelope addressed to Mr. Harris. The waitress watched as the delivery person approached his table and handed him the envelope. He opened it carefully, pulling out a stack of papers. As he read through them, his expression shifted, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of emotion, a mix of satisfaction and resolve. He set the papers down and looked up, his gaze sweeping across the diner. The room fell silent, every eye on him. The waitress felt her heart pounding in her chest, the suspense almost unbearable. What was in those papers? And what was he about to do? The diner was so quiet that the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than usual. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Mr. Harris as he carefully folded the papers and slid them back into the envelope. The waitress stood frozen near the counter, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of what she'd just seen. Whatever was in those papers, it had clearly shifted something in him. Mr. Harris rose from his seat, his movements deliberate. The envelope remained in his hand as he approached the counter where the manager stood. The waitress could feel the tension in the room growing heavier with each step he took. She watched as the manager straightened his posture, clearly bracing himself for whatever was about to come. "I'd like to speak with you in private," Mr. Harris said, his voice calm but firm. The manager nodded quickly, gesturing toward the small office in the back. The two men disappeared behind the door, leaving the rest of the diner in a state of uneasy anticipation. Whispers rippled through the room as customers and staff exchanged nervous glances. The waitress, however, remained silent, her stomach churning with anxiety. Minutes felt like hours as she waited for them to emerge. She couldn't help but imagine the worst-case scenarios playing out behind that door. Was Mr. Harris angry? Was he planning to shut the diner down because of her behavior? The thought made her feel sick. When the office door finally opened, both men stepped out, their expressions unreadable. The manager looked pale, his usual air of confidence noticeably absent. Mr. Harris, on the other hand, seemed composed, his demeanor as steady as ever. "Can I have everyone's attention, please?" Mr. Harris said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the diner. The room fell silent once more as all eyes turned to him. The waitress felt her chest tighten, a sense of foreboding washing over her. "I've been visiting this diner for years," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "It holds a special place in my heart because it's where everything started. This was the first diner I opened, and it's a reminder of the hard work and dedication it took to build something from the ground up." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The waitress felt a lump forming in her throat, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her even harder. "But," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, "what I witnessed here yesterday was deeply disappointing. This diner was built on a foundation of respect and kindness values that should be reflected in every interaction, no matter who walks through that door." The waitress's cheeks burned as she realized he was talking about her. She wanted to disappear, to shrink into the background and avoid the weight of his words. But she couldn't look away. "I've always believed that how we treat others when we think no one is watching says a lot about who we are," he said, his gaze landing on her. "And yesterday, I saw something that didn't align with the principles this diner was built on." Her breath caught in her throat as he paused, the silence in the room almost deafening. She expected him to call her out directly, to reprimand her in front of everyone. But instead, he turned his attention back to the rest of the room. "However," he said, his tone softening, "I also believe in second chances. We all make mistakes, and what matters most is how we choose to move forward." The waitress felt a flicker of hope, though it was quickly overshadowed by a new wave of uncertainty. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. Mr. Harris reached into the envelope and pulled out a set of documents. He handed them to the manager, who looked at them with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "These are the plans for the future of this diner," Mr. Harris explained, his voice steady. "I've decided it's time for some changes that will ensure this place continues to thrive and uphold the values it was built on." The manager nodded, though his expression remained tense. The waitress couldn't help but wonder what kind of changes he was talking about. Would they involve her? Before anyone could ask, the door to the diner swung open again, and a woman stepped inside. She was dressed sharply, her presence commanding immediate attention. She carried a clipboard and a confident air that suggested she was someone important. "Perfect timing," Mr. Harris said, smiling warmly at her. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Blake. She'll be overseeing the transition process for the diner." The room buzzed with confusion and curiosity. Transition process? What did that mean? Mrs. Blake stepped forward, her expression professional but approachable. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said. "I'll be working closely with Mr. Harris to implement some new policies and improvements here. My goal is to ensure this diner not only meets but exceeds the standards he's set over the years." The waitress felt her heart sink. This was worse than she'd imagined. It wasn't just about her anymore. It sounded like the entire diner was about to undergo a complete overhaul. Mr. Harris turned back to the staff, his expression serious but not unkind. "I want you all to know that this isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels valued and respected, customers and staff alike." The waitress swallowed hard, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all happening because of her. And as much as she wanted to make things right, she couldn't help but wonder if it was already the air in the diner felt heavy as Mr. Harris and Miss Sims. Blake continued to speak about the changes coming. The waitress stood frozen near the counter, her thoughts racing. She wanted to believe that this wasn't the end for her, that there was still a way to prove herself, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. After a brief discussion with the manager, Mr. Harris turned back to the room. "Before we move forward," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "I want to hear from all of you. Your experiences, your thoughts, what you think this diner needs to be better. This place belongs to all of us, and I want it to reflect the best of what we can offer." The staff exchanged hesitant glances, unsure of how to respond. The waitress felt her heart pounding as she debated whether to speak up. She knew she had to say something, but the weight of her mistakes made her feel unworthy. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Mr. Harris," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to say something. Yesterday, I treated you poorly. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I acted in a way that goes against everything this place stands for. I'm truly sorry." The room was silent as she spoke, all eyes on her. She felt her cheeks flush, but she pushed through. "I don't know if I can make up for what I did, but I want to try. I want to be better not just for myself, but for this diner and everyone who comes here. Please give me the chance to prove that I can do better." Mr. Harris studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. The silence stretched on, and the waitress felt the weight of it pressing down on her. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you for your honesty," he said. "It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake, and even more to ask for a chance to make things right." Too late. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by the uncertainty of what would come next. She knew this was only the beginning of a long road to earning back his trust. As the meeting continued, the staff began to open up, sharing their thoughts and concerns about the diner. It became clear that there were deeper issues at play: miscommunication, lack of support, and a general sense of complacency that had crept in over time. Mrs. Blake took notes diligently, her demeanor professional yet approachable. She assured everyone that their input was valued and that the changes would be implemented with their well-being in mind. Just as the tension in the room began to ease, the unexpected twist came. A man entered the diner, his presence instantly drawing attention. He was sharply dressed, carrying a briefcase, and he made a beeline for Mr. Harris. "Mr. Harris," the man said, his tone urgent. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a situation that needs your immediate attention." Mr. Harris frowned, his calm demeanor shifting ever so slightly. "What kind of situation?" The man leaned in, speaking in a low voice. Though the words were inaudible to the rest of the room, the change in Mr. Harris's expression was unmistakable. He nodded, then turned back to the staff. "I'm afraid I need to step out for a moment," he said. "Miss Blake will continue to answer your questions and guide the discussion." With that, he and the man left the diner, leaving everyone in a state of confusion and curiosity. The waitress couldn't help but wonder what could have been so urgent. Minutes later, the answer came in the form of a news alert on one of the customers' phones. A major story was breaking about a chain of diners owned by Mr. Harris facing allegations of labor violations at a few locations. The customer gasped, showing the headline to others nearby. The waitress's stomach dropped as she read the headline over someone's shoulder. This was bigger than anything she could have imagined. The news added a layer of complexity to everything that had just unfolded. Miss Blake, noticing the growing buzz, addressed the room. "I'm aware of the situation being reported," she said, her tone measured. "Please know that Mr. Harris is committed to addressing these issues and ensuring that every diner in his chain operates with integrity. That's why changes like the ones we're discussing today are so important." The waitress felt a mix of emotions: shock, confusion, and a strange sense of admiration for how Mr. Harris seemed to be handling it all. It was clear that he wasn't just here to oversee minor adjustments. He was here to rebuild trust from the ground up. As the meeting wrapped up, the waitress couldn't shake the feeling that this was a turning point, not just for the diner, but for her as well. She had been given a second chance, and she was determined not to waste it. But as she cleaned up the tables and prepared for the next shift, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. And how much more would be revealed about the man who had quietly changed everything? The diner settled into an uneasy quiet after Mr. Harris left. The staff and customers alike were still processing the news. The waitress, though busy clearing tables and refilling coffee cups, couldn't shake the weight of everything that had unfolded. She glanced at Ms. Blake, who remained calm and professional, reassuring staff members that things would be handled properly. By the end of her shift, the waitress was emotionally drained. As she hung up her apron, she couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harris's words, his calm demeanor, even in the face of such shocking news. She had seen a glimpse of his character, not just as a successful businessman, but as someone who genuinely cared about doing the right thing. The next day, She arrived at the diner early again, determined to keep improving. She greeted customers warmly, went out of her way to make sure orders were perfect, and even helped her coworkers when they needed it. Slowly, she felt herself regaining a sense of purpose, though the uncertainty of the diner's future still lingered. A week later, Mr. Harris returned. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought a team of people, including Blake, who carried binders and laptops, ready to implement the changes they had discussed. The staff gathered for a meeting before the diner opened, the tension in the room palpable. Mr. Harris began by addressing the recent news. "I know the headlines have raised concerns," he said, "and I take full responsibility for what has happened at some of our locations. That's why I'm here to ensure this diner, and every diner in our chain, operates with the highest standards of fairness and respect." He went on to explain the steps being taken to address the allegations, including third-party audits, employee training programs, and new policies to protect workers' rights. The waitress felt a mix of relief and admiration. It was clear that As the weeks passed, the diner underwent a transformation. New training sessions emphasized customer service, teamwork, and creating a welcoming environment for everyone. The staff began to feel more connected, and the changes brought a renewed sense of pride in their work. For the waitress, the experience was deeply humbling. She threw herself into the training, determined to learn and grow. She started to see her job not as a chore, but as an opportunity to make a difference in people's days, even in small ways. One afternoon, as the lunch rush wound down, Mr. Harris approached her while she was wiping down a table. "You've been doing great work," he said, his tone kind but firm. "I've noticed the effort you've been putting in." She looked up, surprised and grateful. "Thank you," she said. "I just want to make things right." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Mistakes don't define us," he said. "What matters is how we respond to them. And I can see that you're trying." His words stayed with her long after he left. They became a source of motivation, pushing her to keep improving and to treat every customer with kindness and respect. Months later, the diner was thriving. The changes implemented by Mr. Harris and Blake had not only improved the work environment but also attracted more customers. Word spread about the diner's renewed commitment to quality and service, and it became a popular spot in the community. The waitress, now one of the most reliable and friendly members of the team, felt a deep sense of pride in her work. She had grown in ways she never expected, learning the value of humility, hard work, and second chances. One day, as she was taking an order from a regular customer, she noticed Mr. Harris sitting at his usual table in the corner. He was reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee in front of him. She walked over, her confidence now a far cry from the nervousness she had felt the first time she approached him after their encounter. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris," she said with a smile. "Can I get you anything else?" He looked up, his eyes crinkling with a smile. "No, thank you. The coffee is just fine." As she walked away, she felt a sense of closure. The journey had been challenging, but it had also been transformative. She had learned that mistakes were inevitable, but they didn't have to define her. What mattered was the effort to make things right and the willingness to grow. And as the diner bustled with the sound of laughter, clinking dishes, and friendly chatter, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of the rude waitress and the old customer had come full circle, leaving behind lessons of kindness, redemption, and the power of second chances. It was a story she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a reminder that every interaction, no matter how small, could have a lasting impact. And as Mr. Harris sipped his coffee, a quiet smile on his face, it was clear that he, too, believed in the power of change for individuals, for businesses, and for the world around them.